We'll go ahead and get started. Good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Erica Buchanan Rivera. I am the Director of Equity Inclusion here within Washington Township. We have started this parent caregiver series as a part of our district equity leadership team to engage our school community in courageous conversations about educational equity. And we are excited, especially within this month of celebrating LGBTQ plus history, to have Morgan Donatelli Bowe with us here this evening from the Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program to talk about supporting LGBTQ plus youth within schools. Within Washington Township, we have a gender diverse community of students as well as families, and it's important for us to create inclusive, affirming spaces that generate a strong sense of belonging and connection for all students. And we have work to do within our township, and we have learning and unlearning to do. And so I'm very excited to bring along a local expert who can help us navigate conversations of creating inclusive environments and supporting LGBTQ plus youth. Morgan Donatelli Bowe, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Erica Buchanan Rivera. I'm excited to be here and speaking with everyone this evening. So thank you so much for taking time out of your afternoon and evening to spend an hour with myself and a couple others who will be speaking a little bit later. But what I really want to do over the next probably about 40 minutes is really talk through supporting LGBTQ plus youth and hopefully having us in a feeling like it's a conversation with you as parents, as caregivers, as members of your community. A little background information on me, as Dr. Erica Buchanan Rivera said, my name is Morgan Donatelli Bowe. I work with the Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program of Indiana Youth Services Association. I primarily work in the anti-trafficking movement and providing education on human trafficking of youth throughout the state of Indiana. However, through some of that work in my area of expertise and specialty within the anti-trafficking movement, I've had the incredible opportunity to work and develop working groups and presentations and have conversations around supporting LGBTQ plus youth and becoming culturally comprehensive as it relates to working with LGBTQ plus individuals all throughout the state. And so what I'm really looking forward to us talking about this evening is I'm going to try and break it down into 4 main objectives. Just make sure we all are familiar with basic terminology. That's where we'll start. That will be our foundation. From there, we're going to get into a little bit of specific vulnerabilities that LGBTQ plus youth face throughout the state, throughout the country, but really talking about here locally in Indiana. And then we're going to move and take that information and address some of the statistics and understanding that statistical impact of these vulnerabilities and how they are impacting the youth within the community. And we will finish up my portion by talking about how to be an advocate, how to be an upstander for LGBTQ plus youth, and being a supportive caregiver. And I believe you do have the opportunity to put questions in the Q&A. Please feel free if something does come up, if you do need clarification or you have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. And we will definitely do our best to get to it this evening. But let's start and let's build a foundation and just get familiar with some terminology. Many people have heard a variation of the LGBTQ plus acronym. And right now there's all sorts of variations still. You see LGBT, GLBT, LGBTQ, sometimes you see a plus on the end of it, and the list goes on and on. Right now, the most comprehensive sort of acronym that we're using is LGBTQIA+, which, as you can see, is kind of laid out here on the left side of the slide: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, and asexual. And that's how we break down that acronym using the terminology that we see here on this slide. I always say when all else fails, or if you're ever you have a question about how inclusive you are being, just put a plus onto the end of whichever acronym you are using. By adding a plus symbol to the end of it, LGBTQ plus, LGBT plus, LGBTQIA plus, etc. What you're demonstrating is that you recognize that there may be additional orientations or gender identities that are not encompassed within those few letters. And so that's a great way to just start being a little bit more inclusive. I do want to talk a little bit when it comes to terminology. Some of these terms that you see, as they may not be the most familiar, as they might have changed a little bit. So I know when I was growing up, I was familiar with LGBT was mostly the acronym that I knew growing up. And then over the years, things like Q, whether that's queer or questioning, I for intersex, A for asexual have been added. So one of the first things that I would definitely want to make you aware of is it's okay to not know all of the answers, because the language, the terminology is constantly evolving. For example, transgender is the term that we are using. That is the term that is the most comprehensive as far as what a transgender individual is experiencing with their gender identity. And I'm going to expand on that in just a moment. But previously, in the past, other terminology might have been used. It was not uncommon to hear words like transsexual or transvestite in the past. However, that is not the terminology we're using now. That language has evolved, it has updated. So we are using the term transgender. Intersex. For years, this might have also been referred to as, from a textbook standpoint, hermaphrodite was the term that you might be familiar with. We no longer use that term. While it is still being used as a medical terminology, when it comes to the acronym, when it comes to comprehension within the LGBTQ plus community, referring to the LGBTQ plus community, we no longer use that term. We use the term intersex. Intersex just means an individual who is born with ambiguous genitalia, and there's all sorts of ways that can present. That might be identifiable at birth. It might take until puberty for that to become noticeable or seen. So that there's all sorts of different ways that someone can be intersex. However, while this might seem like a new term, it is by no means a new identity or orientation or makeup of a person. Individuals who are intersex have always existed. They've just very often been excluded from the conversation. And so by making sure we're including them in that acronym, we're trying to bring awareness to the fact that intersex individuals have always been part of the community. They've always been part of the world itself. But we need to do a little bit better when it comes to our knowledge of the intersex community and resources for the intersex community. Expanding a little bit on some commonly misunderstood definitions, and what I'm talking about here is that idea of transgender, right? I said previously you might have heard terms like transsexual, transvestite, but we've moved away from that terminology. We are using transgender. The reason for that is because when we look at gender identity versus biological sex or sex assigned at birth, it is what you feel versus what you have. We recognize the assigning of sex at birth to be typically seen as male or female. However, going back to what I was just saying about the intersex population, individuals who are intersex have always existed, but have almost been entirely removed from any conversation. So when it comes to sex and what you have, intersex is included on that sort of biological side of the conversation. Gender identity is expressing what you feel. So you see the two terms cisgender and transgender. Cisgender solely means that the sex you are assigned at birth. So for example, I was assigned female at birth. I identify as female. Therefore, I am a cisgender female. Versus transgender, which is when the sex assigned at birth does not match the identity or the how that person feels. So if you have someone who is assigned female at birth but identifies as male, that would be a transgender male. If you have someone who is assigned male at birth but identifies as female, they would be a transgender female or a trans female. One of the things that always comes up when we're talking about cisgender versus transgender is this common misconception of waking up one day and just deciding. you are no longer male or female. You want to be the other. It's sort of this described as being this sudden feeling. And there's enough data and research to show that that's not really how it works. In fact, if you took an individual, if you took 3 individuals, someone who identifies as cisgender male, someone who identifies as cisgender female, and an individual who was assigned male at birth but identifies as female, therefore a trans female, and if you took a scan of each of their brains, you would find that the person who is trans, who identifies as female, as a trans female, their brain more closely aligns with that of a cisgender female than of a cisgender male. It's not a matter of waking up one day and deciding. It is that what you feel, it's a matter of what their brain understands. And their brain, and the way we can map it out, and the way that we've been able to see it through data and through research, tells us it's not a matter of waking up one day. It's their brain associates who they are with their gender identity versus what they were assigned at birth. It's also important to know that when working with the LGBTQ plus community, you can never assume or determine a person's identity or sexual orientation based on their appearance. Oftentimes, sort of a lot of terminology that's been heard over the years, someone uses the term gaydar. They have great gaydar, meaning they can look at someone and immediately know if that person is LGBTQ plus, right? You can look at someone and know. Well, really, gaydar is just this idea of judging someone off of misconceptions and stereotypes. Gender expression can be broken down into feminine, masculine, and androgynous. But gender expression is not necessarily synonymous with gender identity or sexual orientation. So within sexual orientation, you have gay, lesbian, bisexual, but heterosexuality, being straight, is also a sexual orientation. It is part of that sort of sexual orientation spectrum and continuum that we're going to talk about in just a moment. You also have asexual, pansexual, and queer. So when it comes to thinking that just because of how someone walks, how someone talks, how they present themselves, how they dress, we cannot assume their gender identity or their sexual orientation. Really what this comes down to is this idea of the binary, and this idea that people have to fit into boxes, essentially. This is not a new concept. This has been happening for many years, many generations all around the world. But this idea that a person is either male or female, a man or a woman, masculine or feminine, attracted to women or attracted to men. It puts people in a binary of one or the other. What we know, though, and what we're seeing demonstrated through this continuum, is that life has never existed in a binary, one or the other. Life has always existed on a continuum, meaning you can have someone who is assigned male at birth, and they're male, they are a man, they identify as a man, they present themselves in a masculine fashion, and they are heterosexual or straight, they're attracted to women. And then on the other side of that continuum, you have someone who is assigned female at birth, identifies as a woman, presents herself in a feminine way, and is attracted to men. But all along that, from one side to the other, is a continuum of where people can fall at any stage of their life. So we can see that life, while it has been attempted to be put into a binary, life has never worked that way, whether that's through sex, male, female, or intersex, that assigned, that biological assigned at birth sex, to gender identity of man or woman. But there's also transgender individuals who are genderqueer or two-spirited. Gender expression being ultra masculine or ultra feminine. Well, androgynous gender expression has always existed. It's for people who may not find that they necessarily really fall to one or the other. This is where that term non-binary or genderqueer comes in. It's someone who doesn't really feel like they fit with either male or female. Therefore, their expression and their identity putting them as one or the other doesn't work because they don't necessarily feel like they fit within either. And that is a valid gender identity that we are learning more and more about. There's also this idea sort of that exists within this binary of, because of that sort of insistence that it's one or the other, for a girl or for a boy, we've really sort of pushed that idea onto inanimate objects, toys, as if toys have a gender, clothing having a gender. You know, there's men's clothing and there's women's clothing. At the end of the day, clothing has no gender because clothing has no opinion or free thought, right? It is material that is stitched together and has zippers and buttons or clasps or something of the sort. But that idea of trying to push it into something and say that it has to represent a masculine or feminine presentation, and really it's just clothing, it's just fabric. So what I'm trying to express to you here is one of the things in the first steps to being comprehensive and understanding how we can be caregivers to LGBTQ plus youth is understanding and broadening our understanding of outside of that binary of one or the other. Because when we start to accept that and start to expand our understanding beyond that, we can start to open ourselves to all the different walks of life that someone might be experiencing that lead them to potentially being someone that you are acting as a caregiver for. So as we've talked through this foundation of that acronym and definitions and terms and things like that, I want to shift our focus to vulnerabilities that the LGBTQ plus youth commonly face. And really what we're seeing, there's a number of different vulnerabilities. I just want to hit on a couple. Lack of acceptance by family, by peers, by their community, difficulty finding placement for queer youth in foster care. And this is a really big one. I began doing trainings such as this about 2.5 years ago. And I can tell you, I've probably lost count of the number of times that I've done a training on LGBTQ plus cultural comprehension for all various agencies, organizations, school districts, general community audiences, and had someone representing maybe DCS or acting as a CASA or a guardian ad litem come up to me afterwards and say, so here's the thing. There's not a single foster family in our entire community that will take this child because they are LGBTQ plus, because they are gay, because they are transgender. And so this causes a lot of vulnerability. This causes a lot of questions that we as adults have to ask of if they're not safe at home, if they're not safe potentially being placed in foster care or with a foster family because they're being rejected or they're not being accepted for who they are, they're not being supported for who they are, what happens to that child? Where do they go? Who do they go to for help? And that's part of being a caregiver, is understanding some of those vulnerabilities. And for gay, bisexual, and queer or questioning boys, we often see bullying and hate crimes. We see them being stereotyped as overly sexual or inviting sexual contact all of the time. Oftentimes their first sexual experiences might take place online because that might be where they're learning information. For lesbian, bisexual, gay, or queer questioning girls, we also see bullying and harassment. We see them being misunderstood and told that they're just a tomboy, or they're trying to understand the feelings that they might be feeling for somebody, it being dismissed, it being, being told, well, we all have our friends. So there's nothing different about you. We all have our friends. So sort of, if you have a child who is trying to understand who they are and maybe ask questions and seek guidance or assistance, and that being just completely pushed to the side and dismissed, that can make them very vulnerable as well. For the trans community, they are the most vulnerable to brutal violence and hate crimes within the LGBTQ plus community. Trans women, specifically trans women of color, or not specifically, but rather especially trans women of color, are the most vulnerable to things like hate crimes, homicide as well. And we also see them having difficulty finding housing, employment, and proper healthcare, and being denied access to housing, employment, and proper healthcare. So these vulnerabilities from, now this does say a service provider standpoint, because I train all sorts of professional agencies and organizations. We know that these vulnerabilities can put youth at a higher risk for things like homelessness, substance abuse, self-harm, sexual abuse, and exploitation. And I want to just kind of talk about a couple of these. So this is where we're going to sort of examine that statistical impact of these vulnerabilities. When it comes to the LGBTQ plus community and mental health, we know that LGBTQ plus individuals are almost 3 times more likely than others to experience mental health conditions such as major depression or generalized anxiety disorder. When it comes to homelessness, there's a lot of statistics floating around out there. Some of the most popular ones we see are that 1 in 4 people are LGBTQ plus. That is a very skewed statistic. Really, we know that the LGBTQ plus community only accounts for 3 to 5% of the national population. However, for a community that only accounts for 3 to 5% of the population, when we look at homeless youth, up to 40% of the homeless youth population identify as LGBTQ plus. And the reason for this, we can break down into 46% of that being youth who are running away because of family rejection. 26% may be pushed out of their homes because of family rejection. What I can tell you, this was a national statistic from a national survey that was done. What I can tell you is in Indiana, our numbers are 1 in 4. So 25% of youth who come out as LGBTQ plus, whether they choose to come out, they are forced to come out, or they are outed by a third party. We know that 25% of those kids will be displaced out of their homes because of family rejection. So we're looking at youth who run away. We're looking at youth who are displaced from their homes by their caregivers, by their parents. And then we also see 17% of those youth are individuals who aged out of the foster system and did not have a support system to be there for them when they aged out of that system. When it comes to suicidal ideation, one of the things that I always try and hit on, because I do think it is important, is the elevated rates of suicidal ideation and attempts amongst the LGBTQ plus community. We know that through question, persuade, refer, or QPR suicide prevention training, it tells us that there are on average 25 attempts for each documented death by suicide. When we look at that breakdown, though, we see that LGBTQ plus youth are 3 times more likely to contemplate than their heterosexual peers. They are 5 times as likely to have attempted suicide than their heterosexual peers. A suicide attempt is 5 times as likely to require medical attention than an attempt made by a heterosexual or straight peer. This information also told us that 40% of transgender adults have attempted suicide, and 92% of them having attempted before the age of 25. This is really important to understand. This is a very difficult topic to talk about. This is a difficult conversation to have, but it is always something that I try and highlight. And the reason for that is because that statistic right there, 92% attempted before the age of 25. Individuals who are well versed on brain development will tell you that it is widely believed that the human brain is not fully developed until the age of 25, meaning your brain is still growing, processing, learning, understanding until the age of 25, at which point things like your hippocampus is fully developed, things like your ability to logically respond to fight, flight, freeze, or fawn situations, that's when it's fully developed. When we're talking about the LGBTQ plus community, and we're talking about resources, and we're talking about the impact within our local communities, if we know that many LGBTQ plus youth will attempt suicide before their brain is fully developed, that's a really hard place to be, and that's a hard thing to understand, the things that child must be going through, that that seems like the answer to their frustration, to those things like bullying and hate crimes, to violence that they might be experiencing, to homelessness. And so that's why I wanted to bring this up, because when we're talking about being caregivers, there are definitely things to be aware of. But what I want to do now is shift over to the role of parents and caregivers in supporting LGBTQ plus youth. When we're looking at an ally versus an advocate, being an upstander, I kind of break this down into four stages, really, four efforts. The first being response, dialogue, and seeking information. How you respond to a child coming out matters. Opening dialogue versus judgmental questions. Be open to accepting what you do not know. And then we have activism, right? And that, again, that open dialogue versus judgmental questions, resources, seeking information, and exploring the resources that already exist. And so for a few moments, I'm going to stay on this slide as we kind of get into this role of being a caregiver and really what that means. One of the things that parents might find they are struggling with when it comes to a child coming out is the concept of, people being LGBTQ plus is okay, right? This is being an ally. It's okay to be LGBTQ plus. They support you, live your life, do your own thing. And that idea of being okay with someone being LGBTQ plus, so long as it was someone else's child. The idea of being an ally or supporting the LGBTQ plus community may suddenly flip on its head because the extent of emotions a parent may go through can be overwhelming. These emotions may range from everything from fear to disappointment to guilt. And I want to talk through those. I identify as a gay woman or a lesbian, depending on the acronym. But I identify as a member of the LGBTQ plus community. When I talked to my mom about her response to me coming out, she disclosed that fear was the front-running emotion. Fear for my safety. So as caregivers, as parents, fear for your child's safety, fear for how other people are going to treat your child, how the world is going to treat your child, general fear of the unknown. Disappointment is another emotion that isn't unusual to experience. And that disappointment can stem from, as parents, from the time that you found out you were bringing a child into the world, you may have envisioned a life for them. From their first love and heartbreak, their wedding, having grandchildren one day, all of those are natural things to think about and dream about and plan for. So there might be a sense of loss and mourning for the life you envisioned for your child. There may also be disappointment when, as a caregiver, you learn alongside your child all the things they go through in order to feel safe. For example, it's one thing to dream about the day that your child might be able to buy their own house and get married and settle down and raise a family. It's another to learn that it's so much more than just buying a house when you are LGBTQ plus. You have to look into the area and you have to prepare. Is the city safe for same-sex couples? Is this neighborhood accepting? Will being out in this area put my safety in jeopardy? And as caregivers or parents, guilt may also be there. If you have a child that hid who they were from you, guilt around why they didn't feel like they could come to you immediately. Guilt for not realizing they were struggling with something, maybe loneliness as well. When I asked my mom, the example she gave me is, if your daughter, so say you're a parent and you have a daughter, if your daughter was fighting with her boyfriend or fiance or husband, and she told you about it as her confidant, as a parent, would you go to work and sit at lunch with your coworkers or talk to your friends and say, oh, my daughter's fiance is doing this, this, and this, it's upset her? When you are in that space with confidants, you can share things like that, and they might contribute, oh my gosh, what did they do? well, has he tried this? Can he try this instead? And this is assuming this is a heterosexual relationship. The list goes on and on. But what about when you sit down with your friends and the big thing is, my child just came out to me? Are you surrounded by silence? Do you have support systems that you can reach out to that can react in a way that is supportive of you? Should you even be outing your child to people they've not told it? If they've made a conscious choice to only come out to so many people or a select group of people, we want to be respectful of their reasoning for that. But if you have a support system, how do you navigate those conversations? So as a person, as an individual, that's an enormous range of emotions to go through. But I do want to ensure you those feelings are okay and oftentimes natural because of the idea of the unknown, right? So as parents, as caregivers, you're supposed to be the first point of contact, the one they come to when they have questions. So it can be very alarming to realize you may not have the first idea how to answer those questions. You might be struggling with the idea of the loss of life you envisioned for your child, and that's okay. You are entitled to those feelings and those emotions. But then as the adult, we have to talk about why you, as a caregiver, learning about allyship and supporting the youth in this community is so important. Why being there to support your child or maybe someone else's child is necessary. And understanding why a child might be struggling to accept who they are, helping them to understand there is someone there who supports them. So think back to those statistics I read to you about suicidal ideation, about homelessness, children being displaced from their homes. That is why support from caregivers is essential to the lives of these children. So as we speak of support, I want to get into a couple of ways caregivers can be strong advocates and upstanders for LGBTQ+ youth. If you have a child come out to you, you can absolutely ask them questions, but you don't want to make them feel like they have to justify their orientation or gender identity to you. So I know so many, and the reason I say this is because I know so many people whose parents' gut reaction was to ask, well, are you sure? Or why? What happened to you? Those aren't the questions you want to ask. If someone states to you their orientation or identity, I want to urge you to move away from questioning the validity or certainty of it. It is not your job to gauge their certainty and make them justify their orientation or their identity. As a caregiver, they need you to accept them and tell them you love them. When someone comes out to you, and a friend of mine said this to me and it really stuck with me, when someone comes out to you, they aren't asking your permission to be who they are. They are trying to share who they are with you. So in the same vein of asking questions, if a heterosexual child said they were interested in somebody, would you clam up and refuse to ask them questions? Or would you ask, oh, you like somebody? What is it about them you like? Do they like you back? The same goes for LGBTQ+ youth. Don't run from conversations. That child has come to you because they might be hoping you'll want to talk to them. Now, as caregivers, in theory, this could make someone uncomfortable because they might be of the mindset that caregivers aren't supposed to be vulnerable and ask questions. It can be very difficult to look at the person who you are responsible for raising and teaching and realize you don't know how to talk to them because you are now in a position where you can't offer advice and wisdom because this isn't an experience that you have lived through. So it might feel very vulnerable. And like you're in a very vulnerable position to be asking your child to provide you with answers that you don't know. So one of the best things is to try and have open and engaged dialogue with them. Be willing to ask them questions, but understand that boundary of not utilizing them as a personal Google, right? There are so many things that you can seek out and learn on your own. And so that's another form as well of support, and really also looking to that sort of activism component, because you may not realize, the effect that it has, but dedicating yourself to learning what you don't know. Do you want to be the primary source of information for your child, or do you want them feeling like they can't ask you questions? As their caregiver, you want to be the person that they associate with comfort and nurture. So committing to personal education and seeking out information and resources so you can be their primary source of information, but also knowing who to turn to when you can't answer the questions that they might have. And yes, I am looking at notes, and yes, I am going to skip around a little bit because I want to make sure we have time for a Q&A as well. And activism, an example I want to give is parenting or being the caregiver of to an LGBTQ plus child can take on a new form of activism, which can feel very unexpected and intimidating. You may have to be the one to step out of your comfort zone and speak up about something that is inequitable to LGBTQ plus youth. In the school district that you are in, are the policies at the school inclusive? Can children feel safe going to school with the policies currently in place? Are there groups or support systems for them to seek information and assistance and comfort in school? Because when you're looking at the way that school works for 30 to 35 hours a week, that is their community. Are there places in that space that they can feel safe and they can feel that they can be their authentic self without fear of harm or judgment? And being the one to step out of your comfort zone and be the voice may feel uncomfortable because it's not what you expected or planned to do as a parent, but it is a natural instinct to make sure your child is in a space that is safe for them. The earlier that you give parents the opportunity to learn and to grow and to advocate, the better, because parents, you're training yourselves for sort of this lifelong Olympic run in an attempt to sort of clear the way for your child to be able to move through life successfully and through their community successfully until they are an adult and can sort of take up the running themselves. When it comes to resources, know what programs exist for the LGBTQ plus community, because they might want to feel a sense of community. Indiana Youth Group and Gender Nexus are wonderful programs and resources. For caregivers, Gender Nexus has family counseling for those who have trans or non-binary youth. Look into if your county has a local Pride office, they usually have public contact information. You can ask them for resources and what resources they have for youth who are questioning or coming out. As well as Indiana Legal Services, Indy Pride. When it comes to safety in schools, books in the library, every child deserves to see themselves represented in literature. And so making sure that there are texts that they can access so they can see themselves. And the impact of your presence. This might seem like the simplest one to end on, but it's one I think isn't recognized, always recognized for the impact it has. One of the most meaningful things you can do for an LGBTQ plus child is tell them you love them for who they are and that you support them. One supportive adult in an LGBTQ plus child's life can reduce their suicidal ideation by up to 40%. Just physically being there and showing your support speaks volumes. There's this idea of found family in the LGBTQ plus community that is so strong because so many children had to learn that their parents' love wasn't actually unconditional. For so long, LGBTQ plus people have had to come to terms with unconditional love having limitations or having conditions. If a child feels safe enough to come out to you, and this isn't even getting into the trauma of being outed or being forced to come out, if a child chooses to come out to you, they chose you for a reason. Be there for them. Show them why they made the right choice in trusting you. One of the examples is Indianapolis celebrates Pride every June with a parade and a family-friendly festival. Pride is so much more than a parade or celebration. Pride is a representation of what it feels like to be able to be your authentic self after generations of hiding. Pride is not simply a celebration of being LGBTQ+. It is a celebration of no longer having to hide. Help the children in your life, help your child understand this is pride. That is what it is. They might want to go take them. Embarrass them with a shirt, that says proud parent of an LGBTQ plus child, or I love my LGBTQ plus child. They'll cringe, they'll be embarrassed, but they'll know that they are loved. And sometimes the littlest action goes the longest way. So with that, I will stop sharing and we will get into sort of the panel portion. So.
For this panel, we do have some members from Washington Township joining us. Crystal Haslett, our coordinator of student programs and community liaison, and Jen Dotson, our lead counselor throughout the district. And so I'm going to pose some questions to the group, specifically those within the township, as we want to help those who are viewing this understand the relevance of this conversation and its impact on the students that we're serving. And Morgan will also pose some questions to you too that may come through the chat. I know that we already have a parent who wants to know about some of the studies that you've presented. So if you do have links to that and you're able to share them or place them in the chat, that would be great. But I'll start with Jen, because I know that our counselors are constantly navigating, situations pertaining to gender identity, working with families on gender identity support plans. And so I want you to speak to the supports that are in place in Washington Township specifically to prevent the negative outcomes that research shows that are prevalent for youth who identify as LGBTQ+. Some of the vulnerabilities that Morgan was able to set the stage for in the conversation earlier. What supports do we have here through your lens within our counseling department?
Well, I would say that some of the things I'm going to talk about are going to be running through the counseling department. And some of these things are going to be just a part of the makeup of how we do school in Washington Township. So I would say one major thing that we look at is that connectedness. We want students to feel a sense of connection to their school environment. And we want them to feel like they are in a safe environment, both physically safe and psychologically safe. And so that can look a lot of different ways. That can look like that relationship that a student has with their school counselor or social worker. That could also be the formation of our grade level support teams at the high school level, advisory at the middle school level, where we see smaller groups of kids, smaller than a typical class, working with that advisory teacher. And that really becomes their kind of family within the school that they spend a lot of time with. And I would say our counselors and social workers work really hard to be visible in the schools and to be accessible in the schools. I think that's something we're always trying to improve upon, that level of accessibility and that level of visibility. But it's really important to us that we are not sitting in offices waiting to receive students, that we are trying to be proactive, because we know that a lot of times the kids who need the most help don't necessarily know how to ask for it. And so we know that we can't just wait to receive them. So we are always trying to be proactive in seeking out kids who may need our support. We're doing that through various ways in different places. One way that we are doing that across the board, across the district, is through our panorama surveys, where we are finding students who are struggling so that we can intervene and support them. Another thing that's done in a lot of middle schools right now in the district are minute meetings, which is a face-to-face quick check-in multiple times a year, just to ask very simple, specific questions to check and see if we need to do a follow-up. And one of those things that we're often trying to determine in those meetings is, do you have a go-to adult? Do you have somebody who is your safe person that you feel like you can go to if something's going on with you? Because we know that that makes a huge difference for kids. There are also protective factors that we know make a huge difference for kids. And we know that there are a lot of kids that we work with who have very supportive families, but there are some who do not. And as professionals who work in schools, we have little control over the home environment a lot of times. We can equip our kids with coping skills and things like that, but there's some outside forces that we cannot change. And so what we don't want to throw our hands up and say there's nothing that we can do. So there are various protective factors that we know do make an impact and do make a difference when it comes to kind of having an impact on those negative outcomes. Engagement at school, so being involved in something at school is a big one. That sense of belonging that I talked about, feeling safe, having somebody that they see as a mentor or a role model who accepts them just where they're at that moment. We know that emotional regulation skills, there are definitely a protective factor, coping skills are, and also proximity and closeness to caring friends and having friends and those social connections is another one, along with academic achievement. So those are things that we feel like we are constantly trying to make sure and ensure are in place for kids. Certainly, there's always room for growth when it comes to those things, but I would say those are the things that we are working on the most. I would say we do have, I think, a big push in a lot of places for really openly demonstrating that we are inclusive and affirming for students of various identities. And for that, that's using certain language, using students' pronouns, their preferred pronouns. Not that we don't mess up sometimes, and we try to help students understand we're going to do our best, but really making that good faith effort and communicating that clearly to staff members. Signage around the school. We have GSAs that are already formed or are currently forming. And so really trying to create those spaces as well. But certainly, I think we have room to grow, but I do think we have a foundation from which we are working, a pretty solid foundation, but definitely some room to grow.
Right. And for people who may not be aware, GSA stands for Gender Sexuality Alliance, which is an affinity space for students who may identify within the LGBTQ plus community. And wanting to go deeper into some of your comments, Jen, talk to us more about just some of the vulnerabilities that your counselors who do report and collaborate and connect with you, what they have been observing within our district, and what is being done to currently support students within the LGBTQ plus community.
I would say one thing that is certainly noticeable is, I would say over the last couple of years, we have seen an increase in students who are more open in talking about their identities when it comes to this. And I think that, I would tell you, when I was serving as a school counselor at one of our middle schools, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago, I had a student who was transgender, and it was one of the first that we had dealt with at the middle school level. And we had to call North Central and see what was going on. We were definitely at very, very basic levels of supporting this student. And so I would say the use and the development of gender identity support plans is a huge thing. And that's been a huge area of growth, I would say, within the last year in the district, that we are creating formalized plans that are documented, that are being communicated to families and to staff members for kids who are ready for that. And certainly for kids who are not, at that point where maybe they are ready to be identified in class or with parents or outed. I think that even if we are not doing one of the formalized gender identity support plans, I think that the level of training that our school counselors, school social workers, and administrators, along with teachers, I think that has helped us to approach things from a more affirming perspective, I would say. We're also seeing, a lot of mental health concerns with our students who identify as LGBTQ plus. I certainly can attest to suicide ideation with some of these students. I can attest to, in some places, some derogatory language taking place in schools from other students. And And I can also attest to supporting a large number of students who identify as LGBTQ plus, whose parents are not supportive, or whose the students who don't feel comfortable or feel that they're at a place where they can have or engage in that conversation with their families. And I think for all of those situations, the key thing is that counselor-student relationship. I would say across the board, unequivocally, that our teachers are very supportive in allowing students to meet with their counselors. I hear when I talk to colleagues in some other places, I hear feedback about teachers not wanting their students to be released from class to work with counselors, or hesitation and worrying about missing class. But I would say I have had nothing but very positive experiences with teachers who are supportive of the support that students are receiving through their school's counselors and social workers. And so I think that relationship is huge. I think that our school counselors are really good at determining when an outside referral is needed and when it is time to bring in other professionals and to consult with others. The other thing I would say, when we think about the derogatory language that we're seeing and hearing, I think that one really positive thing, and this is specific to the middle school level, and middle school is a time where we do see kids who are pretty immature and still developing their interpersonal skills in a lot of ways. But I think that advisory is that designated time, and that is earmarked time that is specifically for teaching social skills, interpersonal skills, working through role play situations and addressing those things. So that is the time I would say the most, that when we're seeing a trend with in a certain grade level or with a certain group of students, that we would roll out some lessons through advisory teachers, or even school counselors would go out to classrooms and work their way through doing lessons with students. So those would be the things that I would say we're seeing most commonly. But certainly lots of concerns. I would definitely say I do have major concerns about the mental health aspect for these students. And that's a hard one, especially for students who are not ready to talk to their parents about where they're at. And that's a hard one as you're trying to do referrals and help parents to get on board with those referrals for outside resources. That can be a challenge and a barrier to work through, but certainly something that we try to be sensitive, but still try to get supports for those kids without outing them.
Thank you, Jen. And I appreciate you sharing just the landscape of, just situations that you have to work through as a lead counselor and supporting other counselors and students, as well as families. And speaking of families, Crystal and I know we have limited amount of time. I'd love to hear your thoughts based on your role on the ways in which we can, support our families as well as our communities. We've talked about the supports for students, but can you talk about the supports that exist for caregivers?
Sure. Yeah. And Jen really hit on several things and talked about how hard we work in schools to connect with our students and build relationship. We also know that it's really important to put that same effort into connecting and building relationship with parents and caregivers and families. We're fortunate in Washington Township to have various supportive people in these different supportive roles. We have, like Jen mentioned, school social workers in all of our schools, student support teams in our middle schools that consist of our school counselors, school social workers, deans, and admins. And then those same roles in our high school, but as grade level support teams. So I really encourage parents, caregivers, family members to contact your child's counselor, school social worker, administrator, dean, and let us know how we can be supportive of your family. It's really important to us to build those student family school partnerships. But like you said, Dr. EBR, it's also important that we connect with community agencies and organizations. And so I feel like we work really hard to do that as well. Jen and Morgan talked about the mental health piece. Our school-based mental health partner is Cummins Behavioral Health, and they're in each one of our schools. But as mentioned before, we also work really hard, counselors and school social workers, to refer families to other community organizations or agencies that will meet their families' needs. I was really happy to see Morgan had several local community resources that I'm super familiar with, like Damien Center and IYG, which are so great and that we refer young people and families to as well. And I would just add Trinity Haven is a first of its kind in our city. They provide safe, affirming housing for LGBTQ plus youth experiencing instability. It's very exciting and really loved being a part of just seeing them come into our city and be there as a resource for our young people.
Thank you for providing those resources. You know, IYG and Trinity Haven, I value the work that they do with youth in the communities, especially when you have youth who are facing, concerns regarding familial structures where acceptance lacks. I know within previous roles, I've worked with IYG, who's provided housing for students, especially around the holiday season when students were not able to convene with their families due to lack of acceptance. And so it is great to have, those resources. And they also provide a plethora of education, to the community as well. As far as closing thoughts, Morgan, I didn't see any emerging questions in the chat other than wanting to know the resources that you share, such as the studies behind the brain and gender identity. Any closing thoughts do you have for the audience as we have a minute to spare?
Okay, I will try and condense as professionally as I can in a way that is cohesive. When it comes to working with LGBTQ plus youth, it's sort of what I finished with. You are potentially working with youth who have learned that there are limitations to a parent's unconditional love. And if you've never been in that situation, that is a trauma that children, as they grow into adults, will often never overcome. But having a support system, having a point person that they can go to and feel safe and supported and affirmed can make all the difference. And it's not just make the difference in making them feel loved and supported, but it can also make the difference in them staying alive. And so things like policies in schools and programming and being able to connect them to resources are little things that go such a long way to let them know they are not alone. And as caregivers, as supporters in a school system, you never want a child to feel alone. And that's really what we're trying to express through conversations like this. So, yeah.
Well, thank you, Morgan, for joining us. Thank you to all of our panelists. It is an important conversation, a necessary one that we have to have, as we do work through, these situations on a daily basis, with our students, with families who want to partner, who want to work with schools and need supports. And so it's important to put this conversation on the table for our community so we can learn and grow together. So as a part of our series, we will continue to immerse in conversations about educational equity. You can follow our hashtag WT for Equity to learn more about the upcoming webinars that we have. The next one will be on November 4th, talking about implicit bias that will be presented by the Peace Learning Center. It is one that we've had previously last semester, but it is back by popular demand. So please feel free to come and check it out. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Have a wonderful night.